Sometimes family betrayal cuts deeper than any blade. When young Jesse Thorne lost everything to his uncle's greed, he found himself with nothing but a deed to a crumbling ranch, everyone called Cursed. The Badlands property sat at the edge of nowhere, covered in vines and whispered rumors, a place the family had forgotten. Jesse had no choice but to seek shelter in the rotting manor his grandfather left behind. But as he tried to seal a broken window against the bitter wind, something didn't feel right. What he discovered beneath layers of old paint would change everything he knew about his family's past. Could a house everyone believed worthless hold the key to his birthright? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Jesse Thorne was thrown out of his family home, the sky hung low and grey over the Montana Valley, like an old blanket left too long in the rain. He stood in the yard where he'd learned to ride, where his father had taught him to mend fences, and his mother had called him in for supper every evening of his childhood, and watched his Uncle Raymond load the last of his belongings into a rusted pickup truck. Jesse was 23 years old, but in that moment he felt ancient and impossibly young all at once. His hands, calloused from years of ranch work, hung useless at his sides. The leather saddlebag his father had given him on his 16th birthday lay in the dirt, stuffed with clothes, a few photographs, and his grandfather's old pocket watched the only things Raymond had allowed him to keep. "You understand this ain't personal, boy," Raymond said, not looking at him. His uncle was a thick man with a face like weathered stone, wearing the same worn Carhartt jacket he'd worn for 20 years. "The ranch can't support freeloaders no more. Times are hard, and a man's got to make difficult choices." Jesse wanted to say that he'd worked this land every day since he was old enough to lift a hay bale. He wanted to remind his uncle that this ranch had belonged to Jesse's father, that when his parents died in that car accident 3 winters ago, the property should have passed to him, not to his father's older brother. But the lawyers had explained it all in words Jesse barely understood, trusts and clauses and legal provisions that his father had never bothered to mention. Raymond had inherited everything, and Jesse had inherited nothing but the promise of a place to work and live until he could stand on his own feet. That promise had lasted exactly 2 years and 4 months. "Where am I supposed to go?" Jesse asked, his voice steady despite the hollow feeling spreading through his chest. Raymond finally looked at him then, and there was something in his uncle's eyes that might have been guilt or might have been nothing at all. "Your grandfather left you something. Place called Ghost House Ranch, out past the Badlands. Got the deed right here." He pulled a yellowed envelope from his jacket pocket and held it out. Jesse took it with numb fingers. The envelope was old, sealed with wax that had cracked and crumbled. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a property deed dated 1883, transferring ownership of 200 acres and a main house to Jesse Thorne to be held in trust until his 21st birthday. His grandfather's signature was there at the bottom, strong and clear despite the age of the document. "Nobody's been out there in 40 years. Raymond continued, climbing into the truck. "Place is falling apart, probably haunted knowing your grandfather, but it's yours, legal and clear, more than most men get handed to them." He started the engine, and it coughed to life with a plume of black smoke. "You got until sundown to clear out." Jesse stood there long after the truck disappeared down the drive, the deed clutched in one hand and his grandfather's pocket watch in the other. The watch was silver, tarnished now, with an engraving on the back that read, "Time reveals all truths. J.T. 1865. His grandfather, Jonas Thorne, had carried this watch through the Civil War, through the building of the Montana Territory, through 50 years of ranching that had ended with his death when Jesse was just a boy. He remembered his grandfather only in fragments, a deep voice that rumbled like distant thunder, hands that could gentle a spooked horse with a single touch, and eyes that seemed to see more than what was directly in front of them. Jonas had died when Jesse was 7, and the memories had faded like old photographs left too long in sunlight. The watch still worked, ticking away the seconds with mechanical precision. Jesse flipped it open and checked the time, 9:30. He had maybe 8 hours before Raymond would expect the place empty, and no clear idea of where this ghost house ranch even was. He gathered his belongings, slinging the saddlebag over his shoulder and whistling for his horse. Cisco came trotting from the barn, a paint gelding with intelligent eyes and a patient temperament. The horse had been a gift from his father on Jesse's 18th birthday, bought with money saved over 2 seasons of good cattle sales. Raymond hadn't tried to keep Cisco, perhaps because the horse was registered in Jesse's name, or perhaps because even his uncle had some limits to his cruelty. Jesse saddled Cisco with practiced hands, loading his meager possessions into the saddlebags. As he worked, he became aware of someone watching him from the barn. Sarah Mitchell stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, her dark hair pulled back in the practical braid she always wore for ranch work. Sarah was Raymond's stepdaughter, 21 years old, and as much a fixture of this ranch as Jesse had been. Her mother had married Raymond 5 years ago, bringing Sarah and her younger brother Tom into the Thorne family orbit. She'd been kind to Jesse in her quiet way, never participating in Raymond's casual cruelties, always leaving extra food in the kitchen when she knew Jesse had worked through lunch. "You're really leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. "Don't have much choice in the matter." Jesse tightened the cinch on Cisco's saddle, not looking at her. It was easier that way. "Raymond's selling the place," Sarah said quietly. "I heard him on the phone last night. The bank's been calling for months. He's 3 payments behind on the mortgage, and they're threatening foreclosure. That's why he's pushing you out one less mouth to feed while he tries to figure out how to keep the property." Jesse stopped what he was doing and turned to face her. "He never said anything. He never does. Pride, I suppose, or shame." Sarah stepped closer, lowering her voice, even though they were alone. "My mother doesn't know yet. He's been lying to her, telling her everything's fine. But I've seen the letters from the bank. This place will be auctioned off within the month if he can't come up with the money." The information settled over Jesse like a heavy coat. Part of him wanted to feel satisfaction Raymond was getting what he deserved for his greed and poor management. But another part, the part that had grown up on this land, that had loved these fields and buildings despite everything, felt only sadness. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. Sarah shrugged, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Not your fault, not anyone's fault except Raymond's, really. He borrowed too much, spent too much, never saved for the lean times like your father always did." She pulled something from her pocket, a small cloth bundle tied with string. "I made you some food for the road, biscuits, dried meat, some cheese. It's not much." Jesse took it, their fingers brushing for just a moment. "Thank you, Sarah, for everything. You've been kinder than I deserved." "You deserved better than what you got here," she said firmly. "Where will you go?" He showed her the deed. "Place called Ghost House Ranch. You ever heard of it?" Her expression changed, surprise giving way to something like concern. "Everyone's heard of it. It's out past Copper Ridge, where the Badlands start. People say it's haunted, that old Jonas Thorne went mad out there before he died. Nobody goes near the place." "Sounds like my grandfather," Jesse said with a wry smile. "He was always a bit peculiar." "Jesse," Sarah hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "My mother used to talk about Jonas. She knew him, before she married Raymond. She said he was a good man, but after the war he was different. Kept to himself, built that house way out in the middle of nowhere, and filled it with secrets. She said people used to whisper that he'd found something out there during the war, something valuable, but nobody could ever prove it." Jesse felt the weight of the pocket watch in his vest pocket, the steady tick-tick-tick against his ribs. What kind of something? Gold, maybe, or silver from a Confederate payroll he'd helped capture. Nobody knew for sure, but Jonas never seemed to want for money, even when times were hard for everyone else. He'd show up in town once a month, sell some cattle or horses, and always pay in silver dollars that looked old even then. Sarah glanced back at the house, nervous. I shouldn't keep you. Raymond will be back soon to check on things. But Jesse, be careful out there. Whatever your grandfather left you, I hope it's more than just a haunted house. They said goodbye with an awkward embrace, and then Jesse was riding out of the only home he'd truly known, following the rutted dirt road that led west toward the Badlands. The morning had turned colder, and he pulled his jacket tight against the wind. Cisco moved with steady purpose beneath him, unbothered by the uncertain destination. The ride took most of the day. Jesse stopped once at the general store in Willow Creek to ask directions and buy supplies with the last of his cash matches, coffee, some canned goods, and a length of rope. The old clerk, a man named Hutchins who'd been running the store since before Jesse was born, raised his eyebrows when Jesse asked about Ghost House Ranch. Ain't nobody been out there in decades, son. You sure you got the right place? I'm sure. Hutchins studied him with rheumy eyes, then shrugged. Follow the creek bed north past Copper Ridge. When you see the twin pines on the hill, the only pines for 20 miles in any direction, turn west into the Badlands. Keep riding until the ground turns rocky and you can't see nothing but desert scrub. That's where Jonas built his place. You'll know it when you see it, if the Badlands haven't swallowed it up entirely. Jesse thanked him and rode on. The sun was starting its descent toward the horizon when he finally spotted the twin pines, exactly as Hutchins had described. They stood like sentinels on a barren hilltop, their dark shapes stark against the pale sky. He turned Cisco west, and the landscape began to change. The fertile valley gave way to harder ground, red dirt and scattered rocks, sagebrush and stunted juniper trees that grew twisted and low. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and something older, something that spoke of empty spaces and forgotten places. Jesse's unease grew with each passing mile, but he pressed on. He had nowhere else to go. He found Ghost House Ranch just as the sun touched the horizon, painting the world in shades of copper and gold. The house rose from the Badlands, like something from a fever dream, a 3-story Victorian manor, completely out of place in this desolate landscape. It must have been grand once, with its tall windows and wraparound porch, its gabled roof and decorative trim. But time and weather had taken their toll. The white paint was peeling in long strips, revealing grey wood underneath. Vines had grown up the walls and across the porch, their tendrils forcing their way between boards and around window frames. Several windows were broken, dark openings that looked like empty eye sockets. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, and the porch steps were rotted through in places. But the house still stood. After 40 years of abandonment, through Montana winters and summer storms, it still stood. Jesse dismounted and approached slowly, leading Cisco by the reins. The property was surrounded by a fence made of weathered wood and rusted wire, the gate hanging open and useless. Beyond the house, he could see the remains of a barn, or what had been a barn before the roof collapsed, and several smaller outbuildings in various states of decay. The sun was nearly gone now, and the temperature was dropping fast. Jesse would need shelter for the night, and despite its condition, this house was all he had. He tied Cisco to a porch post that seemed relatively sturdy and climbed the steps carefully, testing each board before putting his full weight on it. The front door opened with a long, drawn-out creak that echoed through the empty house. Jesse stepped inside and was immediately struck by two things: the smell of dust and decay, and the sheer size of the interior. The entry hall was vast, with a grand staircase leading to the second floor and doorways opening into other rooms on either side. Furniture sat under sheets turned grey with age, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like lace curtains. He pulled out his grandfather's pocket watch and checked the time by the last light coming through the windows. Nearly 7 o'clock. He'd need to set up some kind of camp before full darkness fell. Jesse made his way through the house, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floors, opening doors and assessing the damage. Most of the rooms were in terrible condition, water damage from roof leaks, broken windows letting in years of weather, furniture ruined beyond repair. But one room on the ground floor, what might have been a study or library, seemed relatively intact. The window was cracked but not broken, and the roof above appeared sound. It would do for tonight. Jesse brought in his supplies and made a small pile of broken furniture for a fire. As he worked, he kept touching the pocket watch in his pocket, feeling the steady rhythm of its ticking. His grandfather had lived here, had walked these same floors, had looked out these same windows at the empty Badlands. What had Jonas been thinking, building a mansion in the middle of nowhere? And why had he left it to Jesse, a grandson he'd barely known? The questions followed Jesse into sleep that night, curled up in his bedroll near the small fire, the watch clutched in his hand like a talisman against the darkness and the strange creaking sounds of the old house settling around him. Jesse woke to the sound of wind howling through the broken windows and the pale grey light of dawn filtering through gaps in the walls. His fire had died to cold ash during the night, and his breath came out in visible puffs. He sat up stiffly, his back protesting from a night on the hard floor, and checked his grandfather's pocket watch. 6:30 in the morning. The watch face showed no condensation, despite the cold-quality craftsmanship from another era, built to last. He stood and stretched, his joints popping, and went outside to check on Cisco. The horse had found shelter against the lee side of the house and whinnied softly at Jesse's approach. Jesse fed him some oats from his dwindling supplies and stroked the gelding's neck. "We'll figure something out, boy," he murmured. "Always do." But as he looked around at the desolate landscape in the growing light, Jesse wasn't sure he believed his own words. The house was barely habitable, the nearest town was a day's ride away, and he had maybe enough money for another week of basic supplies. After that, he'd need to find work. And work was scarce in this part of Montana, especially for a man with no references and a foreclosed family name. He needed to make this place livable, at least enough to survive the winter that was coming. That meant boarding up the broken windows, finding a way to patch the roof leaks, and clearing out the rooms enough to move around safely. It was overwhelming, but his father had taught him that you ate an elephant one bite at a time. Jesse decided to start with the windows. The study where he'd slept had a cracked window that was letting in cold drafts, and the room next to it had a broken window that had allowed rain and snow to damage everything inside. If he could seal those up, at least he'd have 2 rooms that were weatherproof. He spent the morning searching through the collapsed barn and outbuildings, salvaging any pieces of wood that weren't completely rotted. The barn had been built solid, his grandfather's work. Probably, and even in collapse, there were beams and boards that were still sound. Jesse pulled nails with a rusty claw hammer he'd found and stacked the usable lumber near the house. By noon, he had enough wood to cover several windows and a plan for how to proceed. He'd start with the broken window in the parlor, the room adjacent to the study. It was a large window, nearly 6 feet tall, with an ornate frame that had probably been beautiful once. Now it was just shattered glass and peeling paint. Jesse cleared away the remaining shards of glass carefully, wrapping them in an old feed sack to dispose of later. Then he measured the opening and cut a board to size. As he worked, he kept glancing at the window frame itself. Something about it struck him as odd, though he couldn't quite place what. The frame was thick, unusually thick for a window frame, maybe 4 inches deep. And when he ran his hand along the edge, testing for splinters before he started nailing up his board, it felt cold. Not just winter cold, but the deep cold of metal. Jesse paused, frowning. He tapped the frame with his knuckles and heard not the hollow sound of wood but a dull, solid thunk. He looked closer at the peeling paint. The frame was white, or had been once, under layers of grime and weathering. But where the paint had chipped away most severely, near the bottom corner where water damage was worst, he could see something else underneath. A metallic gleam. His heart began to beat faster. Jesse pulled out his pocket knife and carefully scraped at the paint on the inside edge of the frame, where it wouldn't be visible from outside, even if someone did happen to wander by this forgotten place. The paint came away in thick flakes, revealing more of the metallic surface beneath. It was silver, not painted silver, not some kind of metallic coating, solid silver, tarnished dark in places but unmistakable. Jesse scraped harder, working his way along the frame, and everywhere he cleared the paint, he found the same thing. The entire window frame, all four sides of it, was made of solid silver. He sat back on his heels, his mind reeling. The frame had to weigh what? 50 pounds? More? At current silver prices, which Jesse knew from listening to commodity reports on the ranch radio, that would be worth thousands of dollars. Maybe tens of thousands, depending on the purity. Jesse stood and walked to the next window, then the next. All of them had the same thick, heavy frames under their peeling white paint. He counted quickly. The ground floor alone had 20 windows. The second and third floors probably had at least that many more. If every single window frame in this house was solid silver, painted over to look like wood, then his grandfather hadn't died poor at all. He'd died rich, possibly very rich. Jesse's hands were shaking as he pulled out the pocket watch again, looking at it with new eyes. The silver was tarnished but real, and the engraving on the back, "Time reveals all truths," suddenly seemed less like a philosophical statement and more like a clue. His grandfather had hidden a fortune in plain sight, disguised it as something worthless, and waited for time to reveal the truth to someone worthy of finding it. But why? Why hide wealth this way instead of putting it in a bank? Why build a mansion in the middle of the Badlands and fill it with silver disguised as wood? Jesse thought about what Sarah had told him, that people whispered Jonas had found something valuable during the war, something that had made him wealthy. The Civil War had ended in 1865, the same year engraved on the watch. Jonas would have been young then, probably not much older than Jesse was now. What had he found? Confederate silver? A payroll shipment? Something else entirely? And more importantly, how had he gotten it here without anyone knowing? The wind rattled through the broken window Jesse had been planning to board up, bringing him back to the present. He was standing in a falling-apart house in the middle of nowhere, with a discovery that could change everything, but only if he could figure out what to do with it. He couldn't just walk into town and start selling silver window frames. People would ask questions. They'd want to know where he got them, how he came by that much silver. And then they'd remember Ghost House Ranch, and they'd remember old Jonas Thorne and the stories about hidden wealth. The house would be overrun with treasure hunters and thieves within a week. No, Jesse needed to be smart about this, careful. His grandfather had gone to enormous trouble to hide this fortune, to protect it and preserve it. There had to be a reason beyond just paranoia. Jesse thought about Raymond, about the ranch being foreclosed on, about Sarah and her mother losing their home because Raymond had borrowed too much and managed too poorly. He thought about how Raymond had thrown him out without a second thought, keeping the property that should have been Jesse's by right. A plan was beginning to form in his mind. Not revenge, exactly, Jesse wasn't built that way, but justice. His grandfather had left him this house, this silver, this fortune hidden in plain sight. Jonas must have known that whoever ended up here would need it, would have been pushed out or pushed away, would need a second chance. Jesse would take that second chance. But first, he needed to verify what he'd found. He needed to know exactly how much silver was in this house, needed to understand the full scope of what his grandfather had left him, and he needed to do it without attracting attention. He looked out the window at the empty Badlands stretching away in all directions. Out here, he was safe. Out here, he could work in secret. He had time, not much, but enough to figure out how to turn this discovery into the future his grandfather had intended for him. Jesse picked up his hammer and resumed his work, but now each nail he drove had a different purpose. He wasn't just boarding up windows to keep out the cold. He was protecting a secret that had waited 40 years to be discovered, a fortune that his grandfather had trusted him to find. The silver frames gleamed dully in the afternoon light as Jesse worked, and for the first time since Raymond had thrown him out, Jesse felt something like hope stirring in his chest. His grandfather had taken care of him after all, across the decades and beyond the grave. Now it was Jesse's job to prove himself worthy of that gift. He pulled the pocket watch from his vest and checked the time. 2 o'clock. He had hours of daylight left, and he intended to use every minute of it. There was work to be done, secrets to uncover, and a future to build from the bones of the past. The wind continued to howl around Ghost House Ranch, but inside, Jesse Thorne was warm with possibility. Jesse spent the rest of that day and the next cataloguing his discovery. He moved systematically through the ground floor, scraping away small patches of paint on each window frame, verifying what he'd found. Every single frame was silver, solid, heavy, and worth a fortune. He counted carefully, marking each window on a rough sketch he'd drawn of the house layout. 22 windows on the ground floor. If the pattern held true for the upper floors, and Jesse had no reason to think it wouldn't, that meant somewhere between 60 and 70 silver window frames in total. The math made his head spin. Even at scrap prices, he was looking at a sum of money that would change his life completely. But as Jesse worked, he began to notice other oddities. The door handles, which he'd assumed were painted brass or bronze, had the same telltale weight and cold feel as the window frames. He scraped a patch on one silver again. The decorative trim along the walls, the banisters on the grand staircase, even some of the furniture hardware, all of it painted over, all of it hiding precious metal beneath layers of white paint and years of neglect. His grandfather hadn't just hidden some silver. He'd turned the entire house into a treasury. On the third day, Jesse ventured upstairs. The second floor was in worse condition than the first. More water damage, more signs of weather getting in through the deteriorating roof. But the bones of the house were still sound. The structure still solid despite decades of abandonment. Jonas had built this place to last. Jesse found the master bedroom at the end of the upstairs hallway. It was a large room with 2 windows facing west toward the sunset and a massive 4-poster bed that dominated the space. The bed frame had the same suspicious weight as everything else, and Jesse didn't need to scrape the paint to know what was underneath. What caught his attention, though, was the desk. It sat near one of the windows, positioned to catch the light, and unlike most of the furniture in the house, it wasn't covered with a dust sheet. Someone, Jonas, presumably had left it exposed, as if he'd simply stood up one day and walked away, planning to return momentarily. Papers were scattered across its surface, yellowed and brittle with age, and a leather-bound book lay open in the center. Jesse approached carefully, afraid that a wrong move might cause everything to crumble to dust, but when he gently touched the book, it was still intact, the leather dry but not falling apart. He carefully closed it and saw the word "Journal" embossed on the cover in faded gold lettering. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it to the first page. The handwriting was old-fashioned but legible, written in faded black ink that had turned brown with time. The 1st of January, 1866. I have returned to Montana Territory after 3 years away, and I am not the same man who left. The war has ended, but its ghosts follow me still. Jesse pulled the desk chair over carefully, testing its weight first, and sat down to read. The journal was thick, hundreds of pages covered in his grandfather's neat script. He turned to a random page in the middle and began to read. The 14th of April, 1868. The house is nearly complete. I have spent the last 2 years building this place with my own hands, far from prying eyes and curious questions. Let them think me mad, retreating to the Badlands. Let them whisper about the strange hermit on Ghost House Ranch. Better they think me eccentric than know the truth. The silver is secure, transmuted from its original form into the very bones of this house. Every window frame, every door handle, every piece of decorative metalwork, all of it forged from the 12 payroll wagons we captured at Coulter's Creek. Enough silver to buy a small kingdom, hidden in plain sight as common building materials. I pray that whoever inherits this place, if anyone ever does, will use it wisely. I built this house as a bank vault, but also as a legacy. The war taught me that nothing is permanent, that everything can be taken away in an instant. This cannot be easily stolen or quickly liquidated. It is a fortune that requires time and patience to unlock, and perhaps that is as it should be. Jesse read the passage 3 times, his mind working to process what his grandfather had written. 12 payroll wagons captured during the Civil War. That wasn't theft, that was a legitimate military action. His grandfather had been a soldier, doing his duty, and somehow he'd ended up with custody of an enormous amount of Confederate silver. But instead of turning it over to the government or splitting it with his unit, Jonas had kept it. Had he stolen it from his own side? Or had he been the only survivor of his unit, left as the sole guardian of a fortune that officially no longer existed? Jesse flipped through more pages, reading in fragments as the afternoon light began to fade. The journal was part confession, part accounting ledger, part philosophical musing. Jonas wrote about the house's construction, about his decision to live in isolation, about his reasons for hiding the wealth rather than using it. The 2nd of May, 1870. Sarah asked me today why I live out here alone, why I don't move to town or build closer to civilization. I could not tell her the truth, that I am guarding a secret worth more than the entire territory, that every day I wake wondering if today will be the day someone discovers what I've done. The silver weighs on me, not its physical weight, but the moral weight of it. Men died for this metal, on both sides of a war that tore this nation apart. I took it not out of greed, but out of a soldier's sense of duty, better me than some carpetbagger or profiteer. But having it and using it are 2 different things. So I wait, I keep it safe, and I hope that when I'm gone, it will pass to someone who needs it more than I do, someone who can put it to better use than guarding it like a dragon guards gold. Sarah, Jesse's great-grandmother, his grandfather's wife. She must have known, or at least suspected, but Jonas had never told her directly, had kept the secret even from his own wife. Jesse closed the journal and sat in the gathering darkness, thinking. His grandfather had carried this burden alone for his entire life, building a house to contain a fortune and then living in isolation to protect it. The loneliness of it, the weight of that secret, must have been crushing. But Jonas had endured it, and now he'd passed both the fortune and the burden to Jesse. The journal entry had said, "Whoever inherits this place," his grandfather had known that eventually someone would come here, would discover the truth, would have the choice of what to do with it. Jesse pulled out the pocket watch and held it in the dimming light, tracing his finger over the engraving. Time reveals all truths, not just the physical truth of the silver, but the deeper truth of why Jonas had hidden it, what he'd intended, what he'd hoped his heir would do with it. The wind rattled the windows in their silver frames, and Jesse made a decision. He would honor his grandfather's legacy, but he would also use it, not for himself alone, but to right the wrongs that had been done. Raymond had stolen Jesse's birthright, had mismanaged the family ranch through greed and short-sightedness, had thrown him out without a second thought. Jesse would take his grandfather's gift and use it to reclaim what should have been his from the start. And more than that, he'd use it to become the kind of man Jonas had wanted him to be, someone who could be trusted with power, someone who would use wealth wisely rather than hoarding it or squandering it. He stood and made his way back downstairs carefully in the darkness, the journal tucked under his arm. Tomorrow he would read more, would learn everything his grandfather had left for him to know. But tonight he would sleep with new purpose, new understanding, and the weight of responsibility that came with inherited fortune. In the study, Jesse built up his fire and laid out his bedroll. Before settling in for the night, he opened the journal to the last entry, dated 2 days before Jonas's death. To whoever finds this, I hope you're ready. The silver is yours, but so is the responsibility. Use it well, build something that lasts, and remember that wealth without purpose is just metal gathering dust. Make me proud." Jesse closed the book and stared into the fire, his grandfather's final words echoing in his mind. He would make Jonas proud. Whatever it took, he would prove himself worthy of this gift. Jesse woke before dawn, with a plan forming in his mind. The journal had given him the history, but now he needed the practical details. How much silver was actually here? What was the best way to extract it without damaging the house or attracting attention? And most importantly, how could he convert it to usable currency without raising questions? He spent the morning taking a complete inventory, moving through every room with a notebook he'd found in the desk upstairs, listing everything that might be silver under the paint. The numbers grew staggering: 73 window frames, 52 door handles and hinges, 37 feet of decorative crown molding, 2 complete stair railings, and numerous pieces of furniture hardware. But it was in Jonas's bedroom, as Jesse was cataloguing the furniture, that he found something that changed his approach entirely. On the dresser, half hidden behind stacks of folded clothes that had long since rotted to rags, was a picture frame. Jesse picked it up carefully. The frame held a photograph, surprisingly well preserved, a young woman in a Civil War-era dress, her hand resting on the shoulder of a man in Union Army uniform. Jonas and Sarah, Jesse realized. His grandparents, captured in a moment more than 60 years ago, when they were young and the world was full of possibility. The frame itself was ornate, carved with intricate details of flowers and vines. Like everything else, it was painted white, but the paint here had protected the silver beneath from tarnishing. Jesse turned it over in his hands, feeling its weight. Unlike the structural elements of the house, the window frames and railings that were necessary to the building's integrity, this was decorative, removable, portable. He set the photograph aside with care, preserving the image of his grandparents, and examined the frame more closely. It was about 8 inches by 10 inches, perhaps 2 pounds of solid silver. Not enough to make him rich, but enough for a test. If he could successfully melt this down and sell it without raising suspicions, then he'd know his plan could work on a larger scale. Jesse had learned metalworking basics from his father. Every rancher needed to know how to repair equipment, mend broken tools, work with metal when necessary. He'd never melted silver before, but the principle was the same as any other metal: high heat, proper containment, and patience. He spent the afternoon setting up a makeshift forge in one of the outbuildings that was still mostly intact. Using broken bricks and scrap metal from the collapsed barn, he built a small furnace. He had no proper crucible, but he fashioned one from a thick piece of iron pipe, sealed at one end. It would serve for his purposes. The fuel was a problem. The wood from the collapsed barn would burn, but not hot enough to melt silver efficiently. He needed coal or charcoal, and that meant a trip to town, his first since arriving at Ghost House Ranch. Jesse loaded Cisco with enough silver door hinges to sell for supplies, carefully wrapped in canvas and tucked into his saddlebags where they wouldn't attract attention. To anyone who asked, he was just a man trying to fix up an old property, selling scrap metal to buy materials. Nothing unusual, nothing worth remembering. The ride to Willow Creek took most of a day, and Jesse arrived in late afternoon. The town was exactly as he remembered: a main street with a general store, a bank, a feed shop, and a saloon. He tied Cisco outside the general store and went inside, the bell above the door jingling to announce his arrival. Hutchins, the old clerk, looked up from behind the counter. "Back already? How's that old house treating you?" "It's standing, which is more than I expected," Jesse said with a slight smile. "I need some supplies. Coal, if you have it, some basic metalworking tools, and whatever food staples I can afford." Hutchins nodded and began pulling items from the shelves. "Doing some repairs, are you?" "Trying to. Place needs a lot of work." Jesse pulled one of the door hinges from his bag. "I was hoping to sell some scrap metal to offset the cost." This is all over the house, old hinges, brackets, things that were painted over. More trouble than they're worth to clean up, but maybe someone could use them. The old clerk took the hinge and examined it, hefting its weight. For a long moment, Jesse's heart hammered in his chest, afraid that Hutchins would recognize it for what it was. But the layers of white paint did their job, disguising the silver beneath. "Might be able to use this," Hutchins said slowly. "Tell you what, I'll give you store credit for whatever scrap you bring in. Won't be much, but it'll help with your supplies." They worked out an arrangement. Jesse would bring in pieces as he removed them. Hutchins would weigh them and offer credit, and Jesse could use that credit for the supplies he needed. It was perfect, actually. Regular trips to town wouldn't look suspicious, and the store credit meant no cash transactions that might be remembered or tracked. Jesse left Willow Creek with 2 bags of coal, a proper set of metal files and small crucible he'd convinced Hutchins to order for him, and enough food to last another 2 weeks. He felt better than he had since Raymond had thrown him out. He had a plan now, concrete steps he could take, and the resources to begin. Back at Ghost House Ranch, Jesse set to work immediately. He carefully stripped the paint from the picture frame, revealing the silver beneath. In the firelight it gleamed with a soft luster that spoke of quality and age. His grandfather had chosen good materials for his secret treasury. The melting took hours. Jesse had to heat the coal to the right temperature, carefully place the silver in his makeshift crucible, and wait for it to liquefy. He'd found an old iron skillet in the kitchen that he could use as a mold, crude but functional. What mattered wasn't creating something beautiful, but proving the concept worked. As midnight approached, Jesse poured the molten silver into the skillet, watching it pool and cool into a rough ingot. It wasn't pretty. The surface was pitted and irregular, marked by impurities and his inexperience. But it was silver, undeniably and obviously valuable, with none of the painted disguise that had hidden it for decades. He let it cool completely, then weighed it on a small scale he'd bought in town. 1 pound, 13 ounces. At current prices, that was worth about $30 more than a week's wages for ranch work, and this was just one decorative frame out of dozens of items in the house. Jesse did the math, working by lamplight at his grandfather's desk. If he could safely extract and sell just the removable items, picture frames, candlesticks, small decorative pieces without touching the structural elements, he could accumulate several $1,000s within a few months. Enough to start making moves, to begin implementing the larger plan that was taking shape in his mind. But he had to be careful, patient. His grandfather had waited decades to reveal this secret. Jesse could wait a few months to use it properly. He picked up the silver ingot, feeling its weight in his palm. This was real. This was possible. His grandfather's legacy wasn't just hidden wealth, it was opportunity, carefully preserved and patiently waiting for someone who would use it wisely. Jesse thought about Raymond, about the ranch being auctioned off, about Sarah's worried face as she'd told him about the foreclosure. He thought about his parents, about the property that should have been his, about the years of work he'd put into land that had been stolen from him by legal technicalities and his uncle's greed. He could fix this. He had the means now, or he would have it soon enough. The silver in his hand was just the beginning, a test piece that proved his grandfather's system worked, that the fortune hidden in Ghost House Ranch could be unlocked and used for justice. Jesse wrapped the ingot in cloth and tucked it away in his saddlebag. Tomorrow he would make another trip to town, would begin the slow process of converting silver to currency, would start building toward the moment when he could walk into that foreclosure auction and reclaim what was rightfully his. But tonight, he would sleep with the satisfaction of having taken the first real step. The picture frame was gone, melted down to its essential value, but the photograph of his grandparents sat safely on the desk upstairs, preserved and honored. Jesse was doing this the right way, using the gifts he'd been given while respecting the legacy that came with them. Outside, the wind had died down, and the Badlands were quiet under a sky full of stars. Inside Ghost House Ranch, Jesse Thorne was no longer homeless or helpless. He was a man with a purpose, a plan, and the resources to see it through. His grandfather would have been proud. 3 weeks passed, in a rhythm of work and careful planning. Jesse would spend several days at Ghost House Ranch, extracting small decorative items, melting them down in his makeshift forge, and preparing ingots for sale. Then he'd ride to Willow Creek, sell the silver as scrap metal to Hutchins, and use the proceeds to buy supplies and save what he could. It was slow work, methodical and patient, but Jesse found he didn't mind. There was something meditative about the process, something that connected him to his grandfather's long patience. Jonas had spent years building this house, hiding his fortune piece by piece. Jesse could spend a few months unlocking it with the same careful deliberation. The house was slowly becoming livable. He'd patched the worst of the roof leaks, boarded up the broken windows, and cleared out 2 rooms on the ground floor that now served as his living quarters. He'd even found time to repair the porch steps and fix the front door so it hung properly on its hinges. Ghost House Ranch was still far from its former glory, but it no longer looked quite so haunted. On a cold morning in late October, Jesse was working in the upstairs bedroom when he heard the sound of a horse approaching. He moved to the window and saw Sarah Mitchell riding up the path, her breath and her horse's breath both visible in the crisp air. She was alone, and even from a distance, Jesse could see the tension in her posture. He met her at the door, concerned. Sarah rarely left the ranch without her mother, and she'd never visited Ghost House before. "What's wrong?" She dismounted and tied her horse next to Cisco. "Can we talk inside? It's about Raymond." Jesse led her into the study, the warmest room in the house. He'd made coffee that morning, and he poured her a cup without asking. She wrapped her hands around it gratefully and sank into the chair he'd repaired the week before. "The auction is set," Sarah said without preamble. 3 weeks from today, the bank is foreclosing, and they're selling everything, the ranch, the cattle, the equipment, all of it. Raymond's been drinking himself into a stupor every night, and my mother just cries. They're going to lose everything." Jesse felt a mix of emotions, satisfaction that Raymond was finally facing consequences for his mismanagement, and genuine sadness for Sarah and her mother, who'd done nothing to deserve this. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "That's not why I came." Sarah set down her coffee cup and looked at him directly. "Jesse, what are you doing out here?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Hutchins has been talking. He says you come to town every week now, selling scrap metal and buying supplies. He says you're fixing up this place. And people are starting to wonder why." She gestured around the room. "This house has been abandoned for 40 years. Everyone knows it's just a falling down ruin. So why are you working so hard to save it?" Jesse chose his words carefully. "It's mine. My grandfather left it to me. Why shouldn't I try to make something of it?" "Because there's nothing here, Jesse. No water rights, no grazing land worth having, no way to make a living out in the Badlands. Unless—" She paused, studying his face. "Unless there's something here that the rest of us don't know about." The silence stretched between them. Jesse could deny it, could brush off her concerns, could lie to protect his secret. But Sarah had been kind to him, had warned him about the foreclosure when she didn't have to, had brought him food for his journey when Raymond had thrown him out. She deserved better than lies. "If there was something here," he said slowly, "something valuable, would you tell anyone?" Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "The old stories about your grandfather are true, aren't they? There is treasure here." Jesse didn't confirm or deny it, but his silence was answer enough. Sarah sat back, processing this information. "That's why you've been so calm about Raymond taking the ranch. You weren't just accepting it, you were planning something." "The foreclosure auction," Jesse said quietly. "I'm going to buy the ranch back." "With what money?" Then, understanding crossed her face. "With whatever you found here. Jesse, do you have any idea how much it will take? The bank is asking for $60,000 just to cover Raymond's debts, plus whatever bidding goes on top of that." The sum made Jesse's stomach clench. He'd managed to accumulate nearly $3,000 in 3 weeks of careful work, but $60,000 was a different scale entirely. Even if he stripped every removable piece of silver from the house and sold it, he wasn't sure he could reach that number before the auction. But the window frames alone, just the window frames, would be worth far more than $60,000. The problem was that selling them would require removing them, which would effectively destroy the house. And selling that much silver all at once would raise every question he'd been trying to avoid. "I'll find a way," Jesse said, more confidently than he felt. Sarah studied him for a long moment. "I won't tell anyone, not even my mother. But Jesse, be careful. People in this territory have killed for less than whatever you've found here. And Raymond, if he found out," she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. After Sarah left, Jesse sat alone in the study, staring at the fire and running calculations in his head. He needed a different approach, a faster way to access the value of the silver without selling it piece by piece. His thoughts were interrupted by a memory of the journal, of something Jonas had written about banking. Jesse ran upstairs and began flipping through the pages, searching for the passage he half remembered. He found it 3/4 of the way through the journal, dated 1882. "I have considered bringing in partners, men who could help me liquidate portions of the silver for investment purposes. But trust is a rare commodity, and I have lived alone too long to risk it now. Perhaps the next generation will have better luck, or better judgment. The deed to this house is worth far more than anyone knows. It could be used as collateral, if one knew the right people." Collateral. Jesse's mind raced. He couldn't sell the window frames without destroying the house, but what if he didn't need to sell them? What if he could use them as security for a loan? The idea was risky. It would require revealing at least part of his secret to a banker. But if he could find the right person, someone discreet who understood value and opportunity, it might work. He could get a loan secured by the silver in the house, use that money to buy the ranch at auction, and then pay back the loan over time as he carefully liquidated the silver. Jesse pulled out an old wooden box he'd found in his grandfather's closet and opened it carefully. Inside were Jonas's personal effects letters, documents, and pinned to a piece of faded velvet, a medal. Jesse lifted it into the light. It was a military decoration, bronze with a ribbon that had once been bright blue but had faded to pale grey. The inscription read, "For Valor, Battle of Coulter's Creek, 1864. Below, it was his grandfather's name and rank, Sergeant Jonas Thorne, 3rd Montana Volunteers. Jesse had heard of Coulter's Creek. Every schoolchild in Montana learned about the battle where Union forces had intercepted a Confederate supply convoy trying to move silver north from Mexico to Canada. It had been a significant victory, one of the few bright spots in the Montana Territory's contribution to the war effort. And his grandfather had been there, had been decorated for valor in the same battle where 12 wagons of Confederate silver had been captured. This medal was proof of Jonas's service, proof of his legitimate connection to that silver. It wasn't theft or desertion. Jonas had been a hero, recognized by his government for his actions. Jesse held the medal carefully, understanding now why his grandfather had hidden the silver rather than simply declaring it. The war had ended with the country divided and broken. Questions would have been asked about how a sergeant came to possess such wealth. Accusations might have been made. Jonas had chosen silence and secrecy over the risk of having his fortune and his honor questioned. But now, 60 years later, this medal could be Jesse's key. It established Jonas as a legitimate soldier, a decorated veteran. Combined with the journal entries and the property deed, it created a narrative that would satisfy questions without revealing the full truth. Jonas Thorne had been a war hero who'd come into some valuable property and chosen to hide it for safekeeping. Not the whole story, but enough of the truth to make sense. Jesse carefully repinned the medal to the velvet and closed the box. Tomorrow he would ride to Willow Creek again, but this time he wouldn't go to the general store. He would go to the bank and have a very careful conversation with the manager, a man named Carter, who'd been in banking for 30 years and had a reputation for discretion. It was a risk, revealing even part of his secret, but time was running out, and Jesse needed to act boldly if he was going to save not just his inheritance, but the ranch that should have been his all along. His grandfather had been brave enough to fight in a war and carry a secret for 50 years. Jesse could be brave enough to take the next step. The First National Bank of Willow Creek occupied a brick building on Main Street, solid and dignified, in a town where most structures were wood frame and false-fronted. Jesse tied Cisco to the hitching post outside and stood for a moment, gathering his courage. What he was about to do couldn't be undone. Once he revealed his secret to the banker, he would be trusting someone outside his control with information that could change everything. But as his grandfather had written, sometimes trust was necessary, and time was running out. Jesse pushed through the heavy door into the bank's quiet interior. The manager's office was at the back, behind a frosted glass door with R. Carter, Manager, painted in gold letters. Jesse approached the young clerk at the front desk and asked to speak with Mr. Carter about a confidential business matter. The clerk, a nervous young man with spectacles and slicked-back hair, disappeared into the office. A moment later, he returned and ushered Jesse inside. Robert Carter was a man in his late 50s, with silver hair and the kind of face that had seen every possible scheme and still maintained a baseline of cautious optimism. He gestured for Jesse to sit in one of the leather chairs across from his mahogany desk. "Mr. Thorne, I understand you want to discuss a confidential matter." Jesse had rehearsed this conversation in his head during the entire ride to town. He decided on a careful middle path, revealing enough to establish credibility without exposing the full scope of his grandfather's fortune. "I've recently inherited my grandfather's property," Jesse began. "Ghost House Ranch, east of here in the Badlands. You might remember Jonas Thorne." Carter nodded slowly. "I do. He was a customer of this bank, though he did very little business with us. Always preferred to handle his affairs privately. He died, 15 years ago? 16. When I took possession of the property, I found some items of value that he'd left behind. Antiques, mostly silver pieces from the Civil War era." Jesse pulled the medal from his pocket and set it on the desk. "He was a decorated veteran. I believe some of the items he collected have historical and monetary value." Carter picked up the medal and examined it carefully. "Battle of Coulter's Creek. That was a significant engagement." He looked up at Jesse with sharp eyes. "How much value are we discussing, Mr. Thorne?" "Enough to secure a substantial loan. I need $65,000, and I need it within 3 weeks. The banker's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a considerable sum, and the timeline is tight. May I ask what you need it for?" "The Thorne Ranch, the one my Uncle Raymond currently operates, is being foreclosed on. The auction is in 3 weeks. I intend to buy it." Carter leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I'm aware of the situation with your uncle's property. Unfortunate business. But Mr. Thorne, what you're proposing is unusual. You're asking for a loan secured by assets I haven't seen, for a purpose that would essentially transfer property from one family member to another who just recently had nothing." "I have the property deed to Ghost House Ranch," Jesse said, "and I'm prepared to show you evidence of the silver's value. Not all of it. I won't risk moving the items until we have an agreement, but enough to establish that the collateral is real." The banker was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Finally he said, "I'll need to see something substantial, and I'll need to verify the legitimacy of both the property and the items. If what you're saying is true, Mr. Thorne, this could be a very profitable arrangement for both of us. But I won't risk the bank's capital on a story and a medal." They negotiated for an hour. Carter would come to Ghost House Ranch in 2 days, would inspect the property and the silver, and would make a determination about the loan. If he agreed, he would draw up papers that gave the bank a lien on the property and its contents until the loan was repaid. The interest rate would be high, 15%, but Jesse would have access to the money within a week of signing. As Jesse was leaving, Carter called him back. "One more thing, Mr. Thorne. Your uncle has also approached me about a loan to save his property. I turned him down, he's too far in arrears, and I don't believe he has the capacity to manage himself out of his current situation. But if he finds out you're buying his ranch at auction, there will be trouble. Raymond is not a man who accepts defeat gracefully." "I understand," Jesse said. "That's why this needs to remain confidential until the auction." Carter nodded. "Discretion is part of banking, son. You have my word." 2 days later, Robert Carter arrived at Ghost House Ranch in a private carriage driven by a man who stayed with the horses while the banker followed Jesse into the house. Carter's expression shifted from skeptical to astonished as Jesse showed him the window frames, the door handles, the railings, each one revealed as solid silver beneath its painted surface. "Good Lord," Carter breathed, scraping paint off a window frame in the upstairs hallway. "Your grandfather turned the entire house into a vault." "He was careful," Jesse said. "He wanted to preserve this for the next generation without making it easy to steal or liquidate." Carter pulled out a small testing kit from his coat pocket, acids and files that bankers use to verify precious metals. He tested several pieces, nodding with satisfaction at each result. "It's genuine. High-grade silver, most of it." He looked around the hallway, calculating. "The loan I'm asking for is less than 2/3 of the lowest estimate," Jesse pointed out. "The collateral is more than sufficient." The banker agreed. They went downstairs to Jonas's study, and Carter pulled a document from his briefcase, a loan agreement he'd drafted in anticipation of this moment. Jesse read through it carefully, making sure he understood every clause. The terms were reasonable, if expensive. The bank would lend him $65,000 at 15% annual interest, secured by a first-position lien on Ghost House Ranch and all its contents. The loan would be due in full in 5 years, with monthly interest payments starting immediately. If Jesse defaulted, the bank could foreclose and take possession of everything: the house, the land, and all the silver within it. It was a tremendous risk, but it was also his only real option. Jesse signed the document with his grandfather's fountain pen, his hand steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. Carter signed as well, and they shook hands across the desk. "The money will be available in 1 week," Carter said, tucking the document into his briefcase. "I'll have a cashier's check prepared in your name. That should be sufficient for the auction. And Mr. Thorne, I hope you know what you're doing. This is a bold move for a young man." "My grandfather taught me that fortune favors the bold," Jesse said, though Jonas had never actually said any such thing. But it felt true in the moment, felt like something the man who'd built this extraordinary house might have believed. After Carter left, Jesse stood on the porch and watched the carriage disappear down the rough trail toward town. The loan document tucked in his pocket felt heavy with possibility and risk. He'd just wagered his entire inheritance, his grandfather's legacy, on his ability to reclaim what Raymond had stolen. But he felt right about it. This was what Jonas had intended, not for the silver to sit unused in a decaying house, but for it to be used when needed, by someone who understood its value and would treat it with respect. Jesse pulled out the pocket watch and checked the time. 1 week until he'd have the money, 3 weeks until the auction. And then, if everything went according to plan, he would walk into that auction house and buy back his birthright while Raymond watched, helpless and furious, as justice finally caught up with him. The thought should have felt like triumph, but instead Jesse just felt tired. Revenge wasn't as satisfying as he'd imagined it would be. What he wanted, he realized, wasn't to hurt Raymond, but to rebuild what had been lost: the ranch, as it had been when his father ran it, a place of pride and productivity and family. That was a legacy worth fighting for. And now, thanks to his grandfather's careful planning and his own willingness to take risks, Jesse finally had the means to make it happen. He went back inside, built up the fire, and spent the evening reading more of Jonas's journal. The old man had been right about so many things: about patience, about timing, about the importance of protecting what mattered. Jesse hoped he was proving himself worthy of the trust Jonas had placed in him, even though they'd barely known each other. Outside, the November wind was picking up, carrying the scent of coming snow. Winter was on its way, and with it, the moment when everything would change. Jesse was ready. Or at least, he was as ready as any man could be when standing on the edge of transforming his entire life. The cashier's check arrived exactly when Carter had promised, delivered personally by the banker in a sealed envelope. Jesse held $65,000 in his hand, more money than he'd ever imagined possessing, and felt the weight of possibility and responsibility in equal measure. The auction was now just 10 days away. Jesse had done everything he could to prepare. The money was secured, his plan was solid, and he'd even practiced what he would say when Raymond saw him walk into that auction house. He felt confident, ready, certain that justice was finally within reach. That certainty lasted exactly 3 more days. Jesse was in town buying supplies when he noticed Raymond's truck parked outside the saloon. It was barely noon, too early even for Raymond's recent drinking habits. Curious and cautious, Jesse tied Cisco a block away and approached on foot, staying out of sight. Through the saloon's dusty window, he could see his uncle at the bar, talking with animated gestures to a man Jesse didn't recognize. The stranger was older, maybe 70, with military bearing despite his age and a weathered face that spoke of a life spent outdoors. He wore a Union cavalry coat that had to be 60 years old, preserved with obvious care. Jesse couldn't hear what they were saying, but he saw Raymond pull something from his pocket and show it to the stranger, a photograph, it looked like. The old man examined it carefully, then nodded slowly. He said something that made Raymond's face light up with an expression Jesse had never seen before, triumph mixed with greed. Something was very wrong. Jesse hurried back to Cisco and rode hard for Ghost House Ranch, his mind racing. Raymond had found something, had learned something, and whatever it was had given his uncle new hope. The auction was in 10 days. Jesse had the money to win, but if Raymond was planning some kind of legal challenge or complication, it could delay everything or even invalidate Jesse's bid. Back at the ranch, Jesse tore through his grandfather's papers, looking for anything that might explain what Raymond had discovered. He found it in a stack of letters he'd previously overlooked, tucked in the back of Jonas's desk drawer. The letter was dated 1866, written in careful script on paper that had yellowed to the color of old bone. It was addressed to Jonas Thorne from someone named William Blackwood, Captain, 3rd Montana Volunteers. Jesse read it with growing dread. Dear Jonas, I write to you as a brother in arms and a friend, though I fear this letter may test that friendship. I have learned from mutual acquaintances that you have settled on property in the Badlands and are living well, despite our unit having disbanded with nothing but our mustering out pay. You know as well as I do what we captured at Coulter's Creek. 12 wagons, each carrying approximately 500 pounds of Confederate silver, meant to fund their operations in the Montana Territory. By rights, that silver should have been turned over to the quartermaster and divided according to military regulations. Instead, it disappeared, and our unit was credited with destroying it to prevent recapture. I do not know how you managed to spirit away such a quantity of metal, nor do I particularly care. What I do care about is that 6 good men died securing that convoy, and their families received nothing but widows' pensions and my condolences. You have built yourself a life on silver that belonged to all of us, to men who gave their lives for it. I am writing to propose an arrangement. I will keep your secret, will tell no one what I suspect, on the condition that you share a portion of the proceeds with the families of our fallen comrades. They need not know where the money comes from. You can send it through me, anonymously if you prefer. But those widows and orphans deserve something for the sacrifice their men made. If you agree, burn this letter and send word through our mutual friend Hutchins at the general store. If you refuse, I will have no choice but to report what I know to the military authorities and let them sort out the truth of what happened to that Confederate silver. Your decision will tell me what kind of man you truly are, Jonas. I hope I have not misjudged you all these years. Yours in fellowship, William Blackwood. Jesse's hands were shaking as he set down the letter. His grandfather had stolen the silver, or at least he'd kept it when he should have turned it over. 6 men had died, and Jonas had built his fortune on metal that should have been shared among the survivors and the families of the fallen. But there was more. Clipped to the back of Blackwood's letter was Jonas's reply, written in his familiar hand. William, you are right about everything, and I am ashamed that it took your letter to make me see clearly what I had become. The silver at Coulter's Creek was never meant to be mine alone. I took it in a moment of desperation and fear. We were deep in hostile territory, our supply lines cut, and I convinced myself that I was protecting it from carpetbaggers and profiteers who would waste it. But fear and greed look remarkably similar in hindsight. I accept your terms. I have converted the silver into a form that cannot be easily liquidated or discovered. I will send money to the families through you, as much and as often as I can, for the rest of my life. It will never be enough to repay what was taken from them, but it is all I can offer. As for the silver itself, I am keeping it in trust. When I die, it will pass to my descendants, but with the understanding that it must be used to right wrongs and help those in need. I am writing this history into my journal so that whoever inherits this burden will understand its origin and its obligation. Thank you for calling me to account, old friend. You have saved my soul, even if you could not save my honor. Jonas. Jesse sat back, his mind reeling. This changed everything. His grandfather hadn't been a hero protecting legitimate spoils of war. He'd been a thief who'd kept silver that belonged to his unit, to the families of dead soldiers. Yes, Jonas had tried to make amends, had sent money to the widows, but he'd kept the silver itself, hidden away for decades. And now Raymond knew, or at least suspected. The photograph Raymond had shown the old man in the saloon, it had to be connected to this. Maybe it was a picture of Jonas, or of the unit, or something that linked Jesse to the stolen silver. Jesse's carefully constructed plan was falling apart. If Raymond could prove that the silver was stolen, if he could demonstrate that Jesse's inheritance was built on theft, then the bank's loan could be called into question. Worse, the silver itself could be claimed by the government or by descendants of the men who died at Coulter's Creek. He could lose everything, the house, the silver, his chance to reclaim the ranch, and possibly face legal consequences for possessing stolen property. Jesse read the letters again, looking for any hope, any angle he could use, and then he saw it, Jonas's promise to use the silver to right wrongs and help those in need. His grandfather had recognized his crime and had tried to make amends. The money he'd sent to the widows, the careful preservation of the silver for someone who would use it properly, these weren't the actions of a man without conscience. Jonas had been a thief, yes, but he'd also been a man who'd tried to atone for his mistakes, who'd carried the burden of his crime for 50 years and had left instructions for his heir to do better. Jesse could do that. He could honor his grandfather's intention while being honest about the silver's origin. But first, he needed to know what Raymond actually knew and what he was planning. Jesse carefully folded the letters and tucked them into his vest pocket, next to his grandfather's watch. Then he saddled Cisco and rode back toward town. He needed to find that old soldier, needed to know what Raymond had told him and what claims might be made against the silver. The sun was setting as Jesse reached Willow Creek, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. The saloon was busier now, filled with ranch hands and townsfolk finishing their day's work. Jesse pushed through the door and scanned the crowd, looking for the old man in the cavalry coat. He found him at a corner table, alone now, nursing a glass of whiskey. Jesse approached slowly, his heart hammering. "Excuse me, sir, may I sit down?" The old man looked up, his eyes sharp despite his age. He studied Jesse for a long moment, then gestured to the empty chair. "You're Jesse Thorne, Jonas's grandson. I can see the resemblance." "And you are?" "Thomas Blackwood, son of William Blackwood, who served with your grandfather in the war." He took a sip of his whiskey. "Your uncle came to me this morning with an interesting story. He said you've been making regular trips to town, selling silver, and that you recently secured a large loan from the bank. He wanted to know if I knew anything about your grandfather's war service." Jesse's throat was tight. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth, that Jonas Thorne was a complicated man who did things he later regretted. I told him about the silver from Coulter's Creek, and about how my father suspected Jonas had kept it. I told him about the letters they exchanged." Blackwood's expression was unreadable. "What I didn't tell your uncle was what my father told me before he died, that Jonas had paid back every penny he thought he owed, that he'd supported 6 families for 30 years until the last widow passed away, that he'd done right by his debts, even if he'd done wrong in the first place." Jesse let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Then why are you here? Why are you talking to Raymond?" "Because I wanted to meet you," Blackwood said simply. "I wanted to see what kind of man Jonas's grandson had become, and I wanted to warn you that your uncle is planning to file a legal claim against your inheritance. He's arguing that the property and its contents were acquired through theft and therefore should be forfeit to the state, after which he, as next of kin, would have a better claim than you." The room seemed to tilt around Jesse. "Can he do that?" "He can try. Whether he'll succeed is another question. The silver is 60 years old, taken during wartime from an enemy force. The legal status of such property is complicated at best." Blackwood finished his whiskey and set down the glass. "But I can tell you this, son. If this goes to court, it will be expensive, time-consuming, and public. Everything your grandfather tried to hide will come out. Is that what you want?" Jesse thought about the auction, about the ranch, about everything he'd planned. And then he thought about his grandfather's letters, about Jonas's attempt to atone for his mistakes, about the obligation that came with inherited wealth. "No," Jesse said quietly, "it's not what I want, but I'm not sure I have a choice." Blackwood smiled slightly. "There's always a choice, Mr. Thorne. The question is whether you're brave enough to make it." Jesse spent a sleepless night at Ghost House Ranch, pacing the study while the fire burned low and his mind churned through possibilities. Raymond's threat hung over everything like a storm cloud. If his uncle filed a legal claim, even if it ultimately failed, the delay alone could mean Jesse missed the auction. And if the claim succeeded, he would lose not just his chance at the ranch, but his inheritance entirely. By morning, Jesse had made his decision. He would fight Raymond, but not in the way his uncle expected. He rode into Willow Creek at first light and went straight to the law office of Marcus Webb, the only attorney in town. Webb was a man in his mid-40s who'd studied law back east before settling in Montana for reasons no one quite knew. He was known for being thorough, expensive, and effective. The attorney listened to Jesse's story without interruption, his fingers steepled under his chin. When Jesse finished, Webb leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "Your situation is unusual," Webb finally said. "The silver was taken 60 years ago during wartime from enemy forces. Even if we accept that your grandfather should have turned it over to military authorities, the statute of limitations on such claims has long since expired. The government has no standing to claim it now." "But Raymond does," Jesse asked. "Your uncle's argument would be that the property was acquired through illegal means, and therefore the inheritance is invalid. He would claim that as your father's heir and as executor of your parents' estate, he has a superior claim to the property than you do." Webb tapped his fingers on the desk. "It's weak, but it could tie things up in court for months or years." "I don't have months," Jesse said. "The auction is in a week." Webb nodded. "Then we need to beat your uncle to the courthouse. We need to file a declaratory judgment action, establishing your clear title to the property before he can challenge it. And we need to do it in a way that doesn't require revealing the full extent of the silver's value." They spent the morning preparing documents, affidavits, property records, letters from Jonas's journal that showed his intent to pass the house to Jesse, and a carefully worded statement about valuable antiques of historical significance. Webb drew up papers that would ask the court to declare Jesse's ownership clear and unencumbered, based on the valid deed transfer from Jonas and the lack of any competing claims at the time of the original transfer. "This will cost you," Webb warned. "Court fees, filing fees, my time, call it $500 to start." Jesse pulled out his diminishing cash and counted it onto the desk. "Do it." The papers were filed that afternoon. Webb explained that Raymond would have to be served notice of the action, which meant his uncle would know Jesse was moving against him. "This becomes a race now," the attorney said. "Whoever establishes their position first has the advantage. I've asked for an expedited hearing, given the time-sensitive nature of the auction. We should know within 3 days whether the judge will see us." Jesse left the law office feeling both relieved and exposed. He'd taken action, but in doing so, he'd revealed his hand. Raymond would know now that Jesse had money and legal representation, would know that his nephew was preparing to fight. The question was how his uncle would respond. The answer came the next day. Jesse was repairing a section of fence at Ghost House Ranch when Sarah rode up, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She dismounted quickly and grabbed his arm. "Raymond knows about the auction," she said without preamble. "He knows you're planning to bid on the ranch, and Jesse, he's threatening to burn it down before he'll let you have it." The words hit like a physical blow. "He said that? Last night? He was drunk, raging about how you'd stolen his birthright, how you had no right to the family property. My mother tried to calm him down, but he just got angrier. He said he'd rather see the ranch burn than watch you take it from him." Sarah's hands were shaking. "I think he means it, Jesse. He's desperate and drunk and angry, and that's a dangerous combination." Jesse felt cold fury building in his chest. His uncle had thrown him out without a second thought, had mismanaged the ranch into foreclosure through greed and incompetence, and now threatened to destroy it rather than face the consequences of his own actions. "Where is he now?" Jesse asked. "At the ranch, drinking. My mother left this morning, went to stay with her sister in town. She can't watch him destroy himself anymore." Sarah wiped at her eyes. "I came to warn you, because I thought you should know. But also because, Jesse, if you're going to do this, if you're going to buy the ranch at auction, you need to be prepared for Raymond to fight dirty. He's not going to just accept defeat." Jesse thanked her and promised to be careful. After she left, he stood in the yard of Ghost House Ranch and looked at the house his grandfather had built, at the fortune hidden in plain sight, at everything Jonas had preserved for this moment. His grandfather had carried the weight of his crime for 50 years, had tried to make amends, had left this legacy with the hope that his heir would use it better than he had. Jesse couldn't let Raymond's threats and rage undermine that. He had to see this through, had to reclaim what was rightfully his, and use it to honor both his father's memory and his grandfather's intentions. But Sarah was right. He needed to be prepared. Jesse spent the rest of that day and the next making preparations. He rode to town and arranged for 3 ranch hands he knew, good men who'd worked for his father and had no love for Raymond, to watch the ranch property in shifts. If Raymond tried to burn anything down, they would stop him, or at least raise the alarm. He also made a point of being seen around town, of talking to people about his plans to attend the auction, of making it clear that he had both the means and the determination to bid. Let Raymond hear the rumors. Let his uncle know that Jesse wasn't hiding or running. On the 4th day after filing his legal action, Webb sent word that the judge had agreed to an expedited hearing. They would go before Judge Harrison the following morning, 2 days before the auction. It was the best timeline they could have hoped for. That night, Jesse returned to Ghost House Ranch and went through his grandfather's papers one more time, looking for anything that might strengthen his case. He found it in a locked drawer in Jonas's desk, a drawer he'd previously overlooked because the lock was hidden under a decorative panel. Inside were legal documents. Jonas's will, properly notarized and witnessed, explicitly leaving Ghost House Ranch and all its contents to "my grandson Jesse Thorne," with the understanding that he will use this inheritance to right wrongs and help those in need. There were also bank records showing the payments Jonas had made to William Blackwood over 30 years, proof that Jonas had tried to atone for his actions, had fulfilled his obligation to the families of the fallen soldiers. And at the bottom of the drawer was a letter addressed to Jesse, sealed and dated just a week before Jonas's death. Jesse broke the seal with trembling fingers and unfolded the brittle paper. His grandfather's handwriting was shakier here than in the journal, the words harder to read, but the message was clear. Dear Jesse, if you are reading this, then you have found what I left for you. I hope you understand by now that this inheritance is not just silver and property, it is responsibility and obligation. I took something that wasn't wholly mine to take. I justified it at the time with noble intentions, but theft is theft, regardless of the reasons. I have spent my life trying to make amends, trying to use what I took to do some good in the world, but I know it will never be enough. Now that burden passes to you. Use this wealth, but use it wisely. Help people who need helping. Right wrongs when you can. And most importantly, don't let greed or fear turn you into the kind of man I was at Coulter's Creek. I don't know what challenges you'll face or what choices you'll have to make, but I chose you as my heir because I saw in you, even as a boy, the kind of character I wished I'd had at your age. You were honest and kind and fair, even when it cost you. Those qualities are worth more than all the silver in this house. Whatever you decide to do with this inheritance, know that I'm proud of you. And know that you have my blessing to make your own choices, to forge your own path, even if it's different from what I might have done. Your grandfather, Jonas. Jesse read the letter 3 times, each time feeling the weight of his grandfather's words settling into his bones. Jonas hadn't just left him silver, he'd left him a moral framework, a challenge to be better than the man who'd come before. And Jesse would meet that challenge. Starting with the hearing tomorrow and the auction the day after. He would reclaim his family's ranch, but he would do it the right way, legally, fairly, and with the understanding that wealth without conscience was just metal after all. He carefully folded the letter and placed it with the other documents he would show the judge. Then he pulled out his grandfather's pocket watch and checked the time. 9 o'clock. He should try to sleep, should rest before the crucial day ahead. But instead, Jesse sat by the fire and thought about his parents, about his father teaching him to work with his hands and his mother teaching him to care about doing things right. He thought about Jonas carrying his secret and his shame for decades. He thought about Sarah, risking her relationship with her stepfather to warn Jesse about danger. And he thought about Raymond, desperate and drunk and willing to destroy everything rather than admit defeat. Tomorrow would determine whether Jesse's plan would work, whether the judge would recognize his claim as legitimate, and the day after would determine whether he could actually win at auction, whether he could outbid any other parties and reclaim the ranch that should have been his from the start. But tonight, sitting in his grandfather's study with the fire burning low and the Badlands wind howling outside, Jesse felt something like peace. He'd done everything he could. He'd been honest when honesty mattered, strategic when strategy was needed, and bold when boldness was called for. The rest was up to time and fate and the judgment of others. All Jesse could do was show up, tell the truth, and trust that justice would prevail. He finally settled into his bedroll near midnight, the pocket watch ticking steadily under his pillow, counting down the hours until everything changed. Jesse slept fitfully, dreaming of courtrooms and auctions and his father's face on the day he'd taught Jesse that a man's word and a man's honor were the only things that truly mattered in this world. By dawn, Jesse was awake and ready. He dressed in his best clothes he'd purchased in town with silver money, clean and respectable, and rode to Willow Creek under a sky that promised snow. Webb met him at the courthouse steps, looking confident and carrying a leather portfolio stuffed with documents. "Ready?" the attorney asked. Jesse touched the pocket watch in his vest, feeling its steady rhythm. "Ready." They walked into the courthouse together, and whatever came next, Jesse knew he would face it with the same courage and conviction his grandfather had shown all those years ago at Coulter's Creek. Not perfect courage, perhaps. Not courage without fear or doubt. But courage enough to stand up for what was right and to trust that the silver hidden in Ghost House Ranch would serve its true purpose at last. Judge Harrison's courtroom was small and spare, befitting a frontier town where justice was administered with more practicality than ceremony. The judge himself was a grey-haired man with stern eyes and a reputation for cutting through nonsense to reach the heart of matters. He sat behind his bench, a simple wooden gavel resting near his right hand, and surveyed the parties before him. Jesse sat at the plaintiff's table with Marcus Webb, his documents organized in neat stacks. Across the aisle, Raymond sat with a lawyer he'd scraped together from somewhere, a younger man named Peters who looked nervous and underprepared. Thomas Blackwood sat in the gallery behind Jesse, present as a witness if needed. "Mr. Webb, you've filed for a declaratory judgment, establishing your client's clear title to the property known as Ghost House Ranch," Judge Harrison said, his voice gravelly with age and authority. "On what grounds do you base this claim?" Webb stood and laid out the case with methodical precision. He presented the deed transfer from Jonas to Jesse, properly executed and recorded. He showed the will, clearly stating Jonas's intentions. He provided testimony about Jesse's age and legal capacity to inherit. And he established that no competing claims had been filed at the time of Jonas's death or in the 16 years since. "The property passed cleanly and legally to my client," Webb concluded. "Any challenge to that transfer at this late date would be without merit and appears motivated by family spite rather than legitimate legal grounds." Judge Harrison turned to Raymond's attorney. "Mr. Peters, your client has indicated an intention to challenge this inheritance." "On what basis?" Peters stood, shuffling his papers nervously. "Your Honor, my client believes that the property in question was acquired through illegal means, specifically that Jonas Thorne obtained valuable materials through theft during the Civil War. As such, the inheritance is tainted and should be forfeit." "Do you have evidence of this theft?" the judge asked. "We have historical records of a silver convoy that disappeared during the Battle of Coulter's Creek," Peters said, "and we have testimony from Mr. Thomas Blackwood regarding his father's suspicions about Jonas Thorne's involvement in that disappearance." Judge Harrison looked at Thomas Blackwood. "Mr. Blackwood, would you approach?" The old soldier stood and walked to the witness stand, moving with the careful dignity of a man who'd seen too much to be intimidated by a courtroom. He was sworn in and took his seat. "Mr. Blackwood, what do you know about Jonas Thorne and the events at Coulter's Creek?" Thomas spoke clearly, his voice carrying the authority of lived experience. "My father, William Blackwood, served with Jonas Thorne in the 3rd Montana Volunteers. They participated in the battle at Coulter's Creek, where a Confederate silver convoy was captured. My father believed Jonas had kept some of that silver, rather than turning it over to military authorities." "And did your father report this belief to the authorities?" the judge asked. "No, Your Honor." He confronted Jonas directly, and they reached a private arrangement. Jonas agreed to provide financial support to the families of soldiers who had died in that battle. My father kept records of those payments, which continued for 30 years until the last widow passed away. Thomas pulled a leather-bound ledger from his coat. "I have those records here." Judge Harrison took the ledger and examined it carefully, his expression thoughtful. "So Jonas Thorne, if he did take this silver, spent the rest of his life making restitution to those he felt he'd wronged?" "Yes, Your Honor. My father told me before he died that Jonas had paid back far more than he'd ever taken. He considered the debt settled." The judge turned to Raymond. "Mr. Thorne, you're claiming that property acquired 60 years ago through alleged wartime actions should now be forfeit. Even if we accept your claim that the silver was improperly retained, the statute of limitations has long since expired." The government itself has no standing to claim it. On what grounds do you claim superior right to this property over your nephew?" Raymond stood, his face flushed with anger and desperation. "I'm the executor of my brother's estate. I've been managing the family property for 3 years. Jesse was kicked out because he couldn't pull his weight. He doesn't deserve—" "Mr. Thorne," the judge interrupted, his tone sharp, "this court deals with law, not with your opinions about what your nephew does or doesn't deserve. Do you have any legal basis for your claim? Any documentation showing that you have superior rights to property that Jonas Thorne explicitly left to Jesse in a properly executed will?" Raymond's lawyer put a hand on his client's arm, trying to calm him. "Your Honor, we believe the circumstances of the property's acquisition call into question the validity of—" Judge Harrison raised his hand, cutting him off. "Enough. I've heard sufficient testimony." He picked up his gavel, and the sound of it striking the block seemed to echo through the small courtroom with the weight of finality. The property transfer from Jonas Thorne to Jesse Thorne was properly executed and legally valid. Any alleged impropriety in how Jonas Thorne originally acquired his wealth has no bearing on the current ownership, particularly given that Mr. Thomas Blackwood's testimony establishes that Jonas Thorne made good-faith efforts to address any moral obligations he felt regarding that acquisition. Furthermore, the statute of limitations on any claims related to Civil War-era property transfers expired decades ago. The judge looked directly at Jesse. "Mr. Jesse Thorne, this court recognizes your clear and unencumbered title to the property known as Ghost House Ranch and all structures and contents thereon. Any challenge to that title is dismissed as without merit." The gavel fell again, and Jesse felt something tight in his chest finally release. Webb was shaking his hand, congratulating him, but Jesse barely heard it. He looked across the aisle at Raymond, who sat slumped in his chair, his face a mask of bitter defeat. "The auction proceeds as scheduled tomorrow, Judge," Harrison continued, "and Mr. Raymond Thorne, I would suggest you focus on accepting the consequences of your own financial mismanagement rather than attempting to interfere with your nephew's legitimate inheritance. This court is adjourned." Jesse walked out of the courthouse into cold morning air that smelled like coming snow. Thomas Blackwood was waiting on the steps, and they shook hands in silence. "Your grandfather was a complicated man," Thomas said quietly, "but he tried to do right in the end. I think you're cut from the same cloth you just started with better sense." He smiled slightly. "Good luck at the auction tomorrow, son. Make Jonas proud." Jesse watched the old soldier walk away, then turned to Webb. "Thank you for everything. Thank me when you've won that auction and rebuilt your life," Webb said. "But Jesse, be careful tonight. Your uncle didn't take that ruling well, and desperate men do desperate things." Jesse nodded, thinking of Sarah's warning about Raymond threatening to burn the ranch. He would need to be vigilant, would need to make sure his hired men were in place and alert. One more night, and then the auction. One more night, and then everything would be decided. The auction was held in the town hall at 10 o'clock on a grey November morning that promised snow before nightfall. Jesse arrived early with the cashier's check folded carefully in his coat pocket, his heart beating steady and strong despite his nerves. The room was already filling with people, ranchers looking for equipment bargains, speculators hoping to flip property, and townsfolk who'd come simply to watch Raymond Thorne's downfall. Jesse took a seat in the third row, positioning himself where he could see everything but wouldn't draw immediate attention. Sarah and her mother sat across the aisle, both of them looking tired and sad. Sarah caught Jesse's eye and gave him a small nod, not quite encouragement, but acknowledgement that this needed to happen. Raymond sat in the front row, his shoulders hunched and his face haggard. He hadn't looked at Jesse when he came in, hadn't acknowledged his nephew's presence at all. Jesse could smell whiskey from where he sat, could see the slight tremor in his uncle's hands. Raymond had come here to watch his life's work sold off piece by piece, and there was nothing left in him but bitter resignation. The auctioneer, a professional brought in from Helena for the occasion, took his place at the podium. He was a middle-aged man with a commanding voice and the rapid-fire delivery of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The auction began with the smaller items: equipment, livestock, stored feed. Each lot sold quickly, the prices fair but not generous. Then came the land and buildings, the main ranch house, the barn, the working facilities, and 200 acres of prime grazing land in the heart of the Montana Valley. The same land Jesse's father had worked his whole life. The same land Raymond had mismanaged into foreclosure. "Opening bid is $60,000, the auctioneer announced. "This is a complete working ranch with excellent water rights and established cattle operations. Do I hear 60,000? Jesse waited. Let someone else start the bidding. Let the auction establish its rhythm before he revealed his hand. A rancher named McAllister raised his card. 60,000. 60,000. I have 60. Do I hear 65? Another bidder, a man Jesse didn't recognize, raised his card. The bidding climbed steadily: 65, 70, 75. At 80,000, McAllister dropped out with a shake of his head. The unknown bidder and one other competed until they reached 90,000, and then there was a pause. 90,000, going once, the auctioneer called. 90,000, going twice. Jesse raised his card. 95,000, he said clearly, his voice carrying through the sudden silence that fell over the room. Every head turned to look at him. Raymond spun in his seat, his face transforming from resignation to shock to fury in the space of a heartbeat. The auctioneer recovered quickly, nodding at Jesse's bid. 95,000 from the gentleman in the third row. Do I hear 100? The other bidder hesitated, looking at Jesse with calculating eyes, trying to gauge how high he was willing to go. Then he raised his card. 100,000. Jesse didn't hesitate. 110,000. The other bidder's jaw tightened. He looked at his companion, whispered something, then shook his head and lowered his card. He was out. 110,000, the auctioneer announced, going once at 110, going twice. You can't do this. Raymond was on his feet, pointing at Jesse with a shaking hand. This is my ranch, my property. You have no right. Mr. Thorne, please sit down, the auctioneer said firmly. The auction is proceeding according to law and court order. If you continue to disrupt, I'll have you removed. 2 sheriff's deputies had moved to flank Raymond, ready to escort him out if necessary. Raymond looked at them, looked at Jesse, and something seemed to break inside him. He slumped back into his seat, his head in his hands. Going twice at 110,000, the auctioneer continued. Fair warning sold for $110,000 to bidder number 47. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed through the hall, final and absolute. Jesse stood and made his way to the front, pulling out the cashier's check. The bank official verified it, nodded with satisfaction, and began preparing the paperwork. Sarah appeared at Jesse's elbow as he signed the bill of sale, the document that transferred ownership of the ranch from the bank to him. That was brave, she said quietly, and generous. You could have let it go for less. I wanted there to be no question, Jesse replied, signing his name in clear, firm letters. No one can say I stole it or took advantage. I paid fair market value, maybe more. It's mine now, bought and paid for. The official handed him the completed bill of sale, stamped and notarized. Jesse held it carefully. This piece of paper that represented everything he'd worked for, everything his grandfather had preserved for him, everything his father should have been able to pass down. Raymond was still sitting in the front row, staring at nothing. Jesse walked over and stood beside his uncle, looking down at the broken man who'd thrown him out just 2 months ago. The ranch is mine now, Jesse said quietly, legally and fairly purchased. You have 1 week to move your personal belongings out. After that, the property is closed to you. Raymond looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and defeated. I gave you nothing, and you took everything. You gave me nothing, Jesse agreed, But I didn't take everything. I bought what was being sold. There's a difference." He paused, then added, "Sarah and her mother are welcome to stay as long as they need to find a place. I won't throw them out the way you threw me out, but you, Raymond, you need to go. Today would be best." Jesse turned and walked away, the bill of sale tucked safely in his coat pocket next to his grandfather's watch. Outside, the first snowflakes were beginning to fall, swirling through the grey afternoon air. Jesse stood on the steps of the town hall and breathed in the cold, clean air, feeling the weight of the past 2 months settle into something like peace. He'd done it. He'd honored his grandfather's legacy, used the hidden silver for exactly what Jonas had intended to right a wrong, to reclaim what had been lost, to build something better from the ruins of the past. The ranch was his, bought fairly and legally, and now came the harder work of proving himself worthy of it, of becoming the kind of rancher and man his father had been. But that was tomorrow's challenge. Today, Jesse had won. Spring came to the Montana Valley with the gentle insistence of life renewing itself. The snows melted, the creeks ran high and clear, and the land turned green under warm sunshine that promised good grazing and abundant hay crops. Jesse Thorne stood in the yard of the ranch that was once again his family's, watching the sunrise paint the mountains pink and gold, and felt something close to contentment. 6 months had passed since the auction. 6 months of hard work, careful planning, and the slow process of rebuilding what Raymond's mismanagement had damaged. Jesse had hired back the good ranch hands who'd worked for his father, men who remembered how things should be done. He'd repaired equipment, mended fences, and brought in new breeding stock to strengthen the herd. The ranch was thriving again, operating the way it had when his father was alive, efficiently, ethically, and with respect for the land and the animals. The transformation hadn't been easy or cheap. Jesse had continued to carefully liquidate silver from Ghost House Ranch, taking only decorative items and replaceable pieces, never touching the structural elements that his grandfather had so painstakingly installed. The money had gone into the ranch, new equipment, livestock, repairs, and wages for the workers who were bringing the property back to life. Jesse had also made other payments, honoring his grandfather's legacy in the way Jonas would have wanted. He'd tracked down descendants of the soldiers who died at Coulter's Creek, the families William Blackwood had supported all those years ago. To each, he'd sent an anonymous donation with a simple note, in memory of a brave soldier who gave his life in service to his country. It was a small gesture, but it felt right, a continuation of his grandfather's attempt to atone for his actions. This morning, Jesse was waiting for something special. He'd commissioned a sign to replace the old weathered one that had hung at the ranch entrance for as long as he could remember. The new sign had arrived yesterday, and today it would be mounted. The truck arrived just after 8, and 2 workers unloaded the sign carefully. It was beautiful carved wood with letters burned deep and painted in gold leaf. Thorne Ranch, established 1882. Below that, in smaller letters, built on legacy, sustained by honor. Jesse had debated those words for weeks before settling on them. They weren't just about the ranch, but about the journey he'd taken, the lessons he'd learned from his grandfather's complicated legacy. Jonas had made mistakes, had taken what wasn't fully his to take, but he'd also tried to make things right. He'd built something that lasted, preserved it through patience and planning, and passed it on to someone he trusted to use it well. That was what legacy meant, not perfection, but the honest attempt to do better, to leave the world improved in some small way by your presence in it. The workers mounted the sign at the entrance, and Jesse stood back to admire it. This was real now. This was his, earned fairly and built on both his grandfather's sacrifice and his own determination. No one could take it from him, and he would pass it on to the next generation, whenever that might be, with the same trust Jonas had placed in him. Sarah appeared beside him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She'd stayed on at the ranch after her mother moved to town, working as Jesse's bookkeeper and ranch manager. They'd become partners in more ways than one, though they were taking things slowly, building something solid rather than rushing into anything. "It looks good," she said, handing him a cup. "Your father would be proud." "I hope so." Jesse sipped the coffee, thinking about his parents, about his grandfather, about all the people who'd shaped him into the man he'd become. "I found something yesterday while going through the last of Grandpa's papers at Ghost House." He pulled an envelope from his pocket, old, sealed with wax, addressed to the future. Sarah raised an eyebrow as Jesse broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Jonas's handwriting was clear and deliberate. "To whoever stands here reading this, you have found my secret, used my silver, and hopefully built something better than I could manage alone. That's all any of us can hope for, that the next generation will be wiser, braver, and more honest than we were. The silver is gone now, spent on worthy causes or dissolved into the ordinary flow of commerce. But what remains is the house I built and the lessons I learned. Guard them both carefully. And remember that wealth without purpose is just metal, but purpose without wealth is just dreams. You need both to build something that lasts. Be well, be wise, and be better than I was." Jesse refolded the letter and tucked it back into his pocket. His grandfather's final words felt like a benediction, a blessing on everything Jesse had done and would continue to do. "What will you do with Ghost House?" Sarah asked, "now that you've taken what you needed from it?" Jesse had been thinking about that. The house still stood in the Badlands, its windows now stripped of their silver frames but still solid, still whole. He'd considered selling it, but something held him back. It was part of his grandfather's legacy, part of the story that had brought him here. "I think I'll keep it," he said slowly. "Maybe fix it up properly someday. It could be a reminder of where I came from, of what Grandpa did and why he did it. Or maybe one day my kids will need it, the way I needed it." Sarah smiled and took his hand. "Your kids, that's a long-term plan." "I'm learning to think long-term," Jesse said. "From experience, it tends to work out better that way." They walked back toward the ranch house together, their coffee steaming in the cool morning air. Behind them, the new sign swayed gently in the breeze, proclaiming to anyone who passed by that this was Thorn Ranch, built on legacy and sustained by honor. Jesse had been thrown out with nothing, had found a crumbling house everyone thought was worthless, and had discovered beneath its peeling paint a fortune that changed everything. But the real treasure hadn't been the silver. It had been the lesson his grandfather had tried to teach him, that wealth without character meant nothing, that mistakes could be atoned for through persistent effort, and that true legacy was measured not in what you accumulated, but in what you built, who you helped, and what you left behind for those who came after. As Jesse reached the porch, he pulled out his grandfather's pocket watch and checked the time. 7 hours until the cattle buyers were scheduled to arrive. Plenty of time to make sure everything was ready, to present his herd with pride, to continue building the ranch into something his father would recognize and his grandfather would approve of. The watch ticked steadily in his palm, its engraving catching the morning light. Time reveals all truths. Jonas had been right about that, as he'd been right about so many things. Time had revealed the silver hidden in Ghost House Ranch. Time had revealed Raymond's true character and Jesse's inner strength. Time had revealed that family wasn't always the people who shared your blood, but the people who stood by you when it mattered most. Jesse tucked the watch back into his vest pocket, feeling its familiar weight against his heart, and went inside to start another day of the life he'd fought so hard to claim. The past was settled, the present was secure, and the future stretched out before him like the Montana Valley in springtime, full of possibility and promise, and the steady satisfaction of honest work well done.